CCSI Contemporary Computer Services Incorporated. We'd like to welcome you today and thank you for attending today's webinar, Tackling Ransomware Defense in Depth, with Colin Little, a security engineer from our valued partner, Centripetal Networks. For those of you who are not familiar with CCSI, CCSI was founded in 1974 by former IBM technical support specialists. At that time, we provided installation and maintenance for IBM mainframe hardware. As technology evolved, so has CCSI. Our mission today is to provide the highest quality of service in the industry for the full spectrum of technologies. We also have great news to share. This week it was announced that SourcePath, an innovative digital IT managed service and security provider, announced its acquisition of Contemporary Computer Services Incorporated, CCSI, as CCSI's mission now continues, now motivated by SourcePath. I'd like to review legacy CCSI's core competencies, which consist of infrastructure, incorporating data center, IPT, wireless, disaster recovery, video surveillance and access control, customized hardware maintenance offerings, 24/7 application monitoring solutions. We're a managed service provider, network operations center, as well as a managed security provider with our Threat Protect security offerings, the topic we're focused on today. For any questions during today's call, please message them in the chat box to our webinar hostess, Catherine Irizarry. And then at the end of the presentation, you will receive a survey link, and we ask that you complete it so that we could understand what you'd like to see in future webinars. So with that, I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce you to Colin Little from Centripetal Networks. Colin?
Excellent. Thank you, Kathleen. Good afternoon, everybody. As Kathleen mentioned, I am Colin Little of Centripetal Networks. I'm a security engineer here. Been with Centripetal for about 4.5 years. I've been in IT for about 20 years with a focus on cybersecurity in the last 10. And ransomware and fighting ransomware is originally what inspired me to be passionate about cybersecurity. So it makes me really happy to be here today and spread the good word about how we can stop ransomware. And a little bit about, where it came from and what the modern approach really looks like. With that, I will get started. So today we're going to go over the evolution of ransomware, where it came from, where it's going, what the current state is. We're going to go over mitigation of ransomware, how we can stop it. We're going to go over how we've been stopping it versus how we can stop it today. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit at the end about how Centripetal approaches stopping ransomware. A little bit about me. I am former military. I got my start in cybersecurity in the United States Marine Corps. It's really there that I learned how to defend networks in, hostile situations. And I really enjoy combining all that experience today to help folks right in my backyard. I do have former government experience. When I was honorably discharged in 2014, I went to go work with my local state of Maine Office of Information Technology. And it's really there that the fight against ransomware began. Because commodity ransomware began, increasing in its velocity and volume in attacks against specifically government environments, as well as small to medium business. First, I'd like to, go over the timeline of the evolution of ransomware. It's really been developing for about 40 years. Today, we have a dire situation where human-operated ransomware has targeted many forms of critical infrastructure, including, government, healthcare, and utilities. And, the roots of ransomware that led us to the landscape that we're looking at today began before the adoption, the global adoption of the internet. Prior to 1985, law enforcement and the media at large, the news, was aware that there was an escalation of kidnapping and extortion in underdeveloped countries, specifically Mexico and other areas of the world. And what's significant about this is that the trends of that escalation follow the trends that we find in the escalation of ransomware. The methodologies were crude at the beginning and small targets were extorted, and there was a trend of techniques developing and larger targets being sought after. But as you can imagine, physical kidnapping and extortion was messy. It was cumbersome. It was logistically challenging, and it didn't always result in a payment. So it was often brutal in its outcome, right? Then we fast forward to commodity ransomware being developed, right? The modern ransomware that encrypts files and worms its way through networks. That occurred in about 2005. The effectiveness of this approach was facilitated by the global adoption of digital currencies such as Bitcoin. This made the extortion piece of ransomware a lot easier to execute for threat actors because it offered, an easy method of payment and a measure of anonymization towards where the destination for that currency was going. There weren't a lot of controls around digital currencies at that time, right? And then a few years later, ransomware explodes. We see tens of thousands of new variants, large-scale outbreaks, huge targets being sought after. And then with the success, the organization of the criminal elements that deploy ransomware emerges. We see, almost supply chain-like evolution where we have a group that develops, a group that deploys, a group that extorts, a group that launders money. It's highly organized, and that's where we land today. So with that, I'm going to discuss some of the details that are significant in this evolution. I'm really going to try not to regurgitate what people read out there on the internet. My goal here is to so that everybody walks away with some piece of knowledge that they didn't have before that will help them to defend against what we're working against today. Next slide. So here we see the problem demonstrated. We all know that the volume of attacks, the size of attacks, the targets are changing and increasing, right? There's managed service providers that have a lot of people have a lot of data that they need to protect, a lot of clients that they need to protect. The internet makes it easier than ever to reach across the world and touch somebody. With that, there's a few categories of ransomware that haven't changed over the last 10 years or so. We have crypto ransomware. This is the most commonly deployed type of ransomware. It encrypts files and data. What is more common nowadays is that, along with this encryption, threat actors will exfiltrate the data. They'll steal it and add this to their extortion. What's significant about crypto ransomware is that historically security researchers have been able to find some sort of flaw or weakness in the encryption or publicly available keys so that, enterprises will be able to decrypt their data without giving in to the extortion demands of the threat actors. So that is significant. Usually the first question I ask in any sort of crypto ransomware event. Then we have locker ransomware. This is the type that doesn't really touch the data, but will lock the entire device so that we can't use it. This is kind of I would say it's the joke of the ransomware world because you're locking the device that that a victim will probably have to use to pay the ransom, right? And it's oftentimes easier overcome than the other categories because of the technologies in play. It's more prominent in Internet of Things devices, phones, tablets, things like that. It oftentimes appears as, fake law enforcement messages that say that you've been involved in some sort of illegal activity and you need to pay a fine, right? And then we have the one that keeps me up at night, wiper ransomware. This is the one that destroys the operation of the device and/or the data. Sometimes it will mimic ransomware and demand payment, even though there's no way the threat actors can deliver the data back or the operation of the device. So there's a double whammy there. What's significant about wiper ransomware is that it was made more prevalent than ever this year in parallel with the war in the Ukraine. The events of wiper-related ransomware doubled just this year alone. Now we're going to get into, a contrast between what we've been working against, which is commodity ransomware, and what we have today, which is human-operated ransomware. With commodity ransomware, I get what I can. Everything is pre-programmed. If I have money, I can deploy it. I can purchase the ransomware payload from an affiliate service, and I can rent a botnet to deliver phishing emails. Oftentimes, the ransomware is detonated on a fringe device, a laptop, and the pre-programmed worm capabilities of that ransomware will determine the impact, along with how the network is set up, right? The extortion demands vary wildly. The threat actors sometimes ask for $10, sometimes they ask for 10 million. There's no real targeting in this type of commodity ransomware. It's very spray and pray in a general sense. Whereas with human operated ransomware, we have humans adjusting the operation at every turn. They can perform manual processes to make sure they get to the core of the infrastructure, and they can calculate their extortion demands based on the company that they're attacking, their annual revenue or whatever the case might be. The fact of the matter is it takes many different skill sets and many different people to pull off a human-operated ransomware attack. And this plays into the evolution and adoption of the organized crime element of this particular cyber event. Next, I'd like to go through the evolution of some techniques, tactics, and procedures that are common throughout the life cycle of a ransomware attack. A lot of these are well known, and I'm not going to read the text off the screen, right? But today, what's notable about the different stages of the attack is that delivery has evolved to where the threat actors are actually advertising for what they call initial access brokers. These are disgruntled employees looking to make a quick buck that deliver the payload from the inside. So that way the threat actors can bypass any sort of phishing email security. They don't have to rely on a user weakness to click a link or open an attachment. They can just pay somebody $50,000 and they'll plug a USB into something, right? But as you can see, there are many different delivery techniques. And the reason why there are so many is that they all still work. Even after, many years of defending against the same type of delivery method, they're still somewhat effective. After delivery, we have the infection stage. What's notable about the infection stage in today's ransomware environment is the credential theft and privilege escalation aspect of the infection. So oftentimes, once the bad guys are in, they stay quiet and they do a lot of discovery. They'll scan the network, they'll see what they have access to, they'll try to elevate their privilege to domain administrator levels so that they can create new accounts, establish persistence, and detonate the ransomware when they're ready on the core of the network and spread it as widely as they can, right? After they're ready to detonate their payload and start taking over data, that's when the encryption starts. Historically, the encryption required connection to the internet, and that command and control and key generation was essential for the operation. With human operated ransomware, that can all sort of be done quietly. What's notable about the encryption and forensically important is the ransom note itself. Oftentimes, by comparing the ransom note to known techniques, tactics, and procedures, I can determine which variant I'm working with, and that sort of context will let me know if there are other options other than paying the ransomware to overcome the infection. Obviously, this is not a place where anybody wants to be at the encryption phase, but oftentimes the forensic analysis of the ransom note in particular, or the file extensions generated, will help me to understand what I'm working with and what my options are. And this is really something that security researchers can help with, right? And then we have the exploitation phase, right? The bad guy has done what he wants to do, and now he's going to target his ransom demands or whatever the case might be. This is where they'll advertise that they've exfiltrated data, they'll threaten to publicly release it, and they'll extort not just for the release of the files so that business operations can continue, but the release of the files so that the bad guys don't leak that data all over the internet, which can be very damaging to a brand, right? And as I said before, the extortion of the release of the data is now twofold. It's not just unlocking the files, it's the hostage situation around the files, right? That is the end of the evolution portion. So we all got our history lesson. We can hang up our blankies and our chocolate milk. Now I want to get into how we can stop it, right? And really, I'm going to try and take a broad approach at this and go all the way from the internet to the user and back, because in my experience, that layered defense approach is the best way to mitigate ransomware, as well as, a fundamental of cybersecurity, right? And we're going to get into a lot of things here that both CCSI and Centripetal excel at, right? And from a broad perspective, a lot of these mitigation techniques are well known, well documented by many different organizations, from vendors to security researchers. There's a couple that I want to touch on that may be novel, that some don't think about, right? But to mitigate ransomware, we start at the internet, right? What's trying to reconnoiter my perimeter, and what are the current events, and how are they relevant to my defense? For the reconnaissance piece, what's important that some don't think of is my attack surface visibility, right? So there's a demarcation point between my enterprise and the internet. What can the bad guys see? Where is that published? And what information is published? Is that my email service that anybody can see? And is it an older version that has some sort of specific vulnerability? Mitigating that visibility to the threat actors provides concealment, which in a military sense is almost as important as cover itself, right? In cover, I am blocking the incoming fire. In concealment, the bad guys don't even know I'm there. This is important because with human operated ransomware, the business targeting aspect can be done passively. I won't get a cybersecurity alert from one of my tools that a bad guy is reading up on my annual revenue at some external website, or accessing a so-called security research firm looking for what services and servers I have facing the internet and what vulnerabilities or whatever the case might be, weaknesses that might be a vector of approach for their attack. After the internet, we get to our perimeter, right? And we live in a remote workforce age. So sometimes the perimeter is not well established, right? And a lot of enterprises today are struggling with that. The good news here is that there are emerging technologies to assist with this, not just at the traditional perimeter, but at the endpoint, right? And a couple of things that I'd like to talk about is the concept of the zero trust gateway. This is one of the tools that I work with at Centripetal. And it's highly effective at consuming many data points to the tune of billions of data points at the perimeter, right? We can talk more about that if you're interested. But a couple of the things that are really important as well at my perimeter are those vulnerability assessments and penetration testing. Now, I have a different term on the screen here because when I look for a good penetration test of my perimeter, what I'm really looking for is adversarial emulation. Like, it's important to know what vulnerabilities I have, but what's more important to me as a defender is how can those vulnerabilities be chained together? And after a vulnerability is exploited, what's the next step for the threat actors? How far can they actually get, right? It's also here that third-party access and access management are extremely important. The third-party risk factor in a ransomware attack at the perimeter is more important than ever nowadays, as we see with the the Kaseya supply chain compromise that occurred a couple of years ago. Um, so these are all important considerations that are really prevalent in more of a policy and compliance perspective. Um, a lot of businesses nowadays are performing third-party risk assessments before they can consider doing business with one of those third parties. And a lot of audit certifications or compliance certification measures will tell an enterprise up front if a third party has, certain controls in place to mitigate those risks, that they themselves are compromised, and the trusted pathway between them and us could be a vector of approach, right? But really, the traditional perimeter security is still important because the traditional delivery methods are still working. So it's really important that my firewall is configured appropriately, that I have good email security, and things like that at the perimeter. What is also significant before I move on is the emergence of COVID-19. The Coveware quarterly ransomware report that's quoted down below is chronologically significant in terms of that global event. A lot of organizations stood up virtual private networking technology very hastily. They didn't leverage experts like CCSI to stand those up, and they were vulnerable, right? So the events that are not cyber events that have global reach and a impact on the decisions that I make as a business can sometimes play a part in whether I'm vulnerable or not. Then we get inside the network, right? And there are a few tools and processes that are extremely important here. What's relevant to today's threat landscape when it comes to ransomware is the threat actor's ability to move laterally and escalate their privileges. So the security of my identity system, in a Windows environment that's Active Directory, is paramount. A lot of folks that I talk to are focused on the signature detection of ransomware, but they're not really aware of the new features coming out that will mitigate a lot of the risk in their own core systems that have reach into every asset of their local area network, right? But it's also here that continuous monitoring and log analysis is really important. The evolution of data analytics on the defender side has really helped us to be able to effectively alert and strongly, quickly respond to an event before the bad guys get to that encryption and exploitation phase, right? And there's some specific things that we can look for on our LAN that will alert us that there may be an issue, and we get into those some of those on the next slide, but so I'll try to reserve myself for that. But the other important thing, really important here, is administrative credential segmentation, right? So my system administrators, those ones that have rights to install, rights to remote into a core system and things like that, those credentials should be segmented and strictly controlled. What's also going to help us here is data protection and loss prevention. This is deploying encryption at rest, having a inventory of what type of sensitive data I have, where it lives, and what my controls are around that, right? And then a lot of the other traditional stuff, strong patching, identification of what those critical assets are. This is all important. And I know there's not a lot of details in here. What I would like to offer you as a perspective for these bullet points is that each one of them is a doorway. And inside that doorway is a room with a lot of other objects, right? So for each one of these bullet points, there's a volume of expertise that both CCSI and Centripetal can deploy to get into the details of how those operations can be performed in your environment with ease and automation, as well as secured, right? We get to the endpoint. What's really relevant here to me from the Microsoft Digital Defense Report is that almost all human operated ransomware attacks attempt to tamper with security and backup products. This is amazing to me because they use built-in tools to tamper with these security services. So at this point, the bad guys are really living off the land or deploying tool sets to do whatever it is they're trying to do, whether it's turn the antivirus off or steal credentials or delete volume shadow copies, whatever the case might be, right? What we can do to mitigate at the endpoint is to make it the tool for the job. A computer is an amazing piece of technology and it will do almost anything you tell it to do. But there's a few fundamental processes that are called out in the last 3 bullet points there, right? Least privilege access, software restriction, those things are going to be strong for the defense of the endpoint. A lot of times the threat actors are using administrative tools such as PowerShell to move laterally across the network or run a script or establish persistence. If I'm following these principles, the user's account will not be able to use those tools and perform those operations, right? But it's also here that monitoring and alerting are really important, especially with human operated ransomware. With commodity ransomware, it's very noisy. It detonates, I get a ransom note, everything changes, my file extensions change. With human operated ransomware, it might be a service stopping or something that I wouldn't notice unless I was paying very close attention or had some sort of alerting that, you know, if I'm running McAfee antivirus, that its scanner service stopped, but the device didn't shut down. That would be a clear alert to me. Or that PowerShell is attempting to drop a screensaver file into a temporary directory. These are things that I've seen in the past in the kill chain of ransomware delivery and execution. And nothing that any legitimate application or user operation would perform, right? And then we get to the user. The users are our last line of defense. What's significant is that, you know, there's a lot of good relevant security awareness training, but it's not deployed across our user base, specifically in state and local government. The reason why that's critical is that I can deploy security technologies all day. A good example is multi-factor authentication, right? Where a user needs something they know and something they have for authenticating to a system. They know the password, they have a phone which can generate a random code that will then let them into the system. If a user doesn't understand why those security measures are there, I've seen in the past where a user gets a push notification on their phone saying, hey, are you trying to log into, I don't know, the domain controller? And they just say yes, even if they're not. So user adoption and understanding of why those security technologies are in place will strongly mitigate things like MFA fatigue and the bypassing of those controls, right? There was actually a very recent huge breach where MFA fatigue was deployed. The threat actor pretended to be from the IT department and just kept spamming one user with push notifications and told them that if they wanted it to stop, they had to allow it, and it was successful. So there's also a lot of good fundamentals and exercises that we can deploy to the users to make it interactive, because in this day and age, even the user is afraid of ransomware. I've talked to people who it wasn't an enterprise asset that got ransomware, it was their personal asset, and they lost a lifetime of family pictures, they lost everything, and it was tragic and heartbreaking. So along with relevant security awareness training, we can do tabletop exercises with not just the user, but also our internal operations teams, our internal security teams to say, okay, hey, we just got this alert. What's our next step? And then from there, where do we go? These tabletop exercises are role-playing based, and they help to identify weak spots in the process or in the response. And I find them an extremely useful tool to identify where I'm short, whether it's in a written policy or a technical control or in my visibility of critical assets. Tabletop exercises are a valuable tool. And that's the details of the mitigation portion, right? Now I'd like to compare the legacy approach with what I view should be done today, right? As far as how we should approach mitigation of ransomware. What we have today is we're alerted when the bad guy is already in and executing his payload and encryption is already occurring, and the bad guy's writing his support contract with the client, right? It's very much a client relationship now. Some ransomware variant threat actors have support chats and things like that, but we don't get alerted until they're actually executing. We're still deploying tools that have a single source of data, and sometimes those tools are deployed by many vendors. What we end up with is what I call the vendor tool human leadership divide. This is not anything that anybody has heard of. It was made in my own crazy head, but we're expecting vendors to make a tool that we can have humans to understand and operate, that the leadership understands why they're there. And those divides create gaps in our ability to deploy. If the leadership has no buy-in in security, nothing happens. If our humans, if our security operations teams or our IT staff don't understand the full configurability of a tool or all the features in it, there's likely going to be a misconfiguration. The vendor doesn't know what services we need to make the business run. So they are at a disadvantage by not having that institutional knowledge, and sometimes security tools break legitimate services as a result. And a lot of environments that I work in, a security tool misconfiguration stopping business is just as dangerous as a ransomware attack. And then, of course, the vendor themselves, their techniques vary wildly from vendor to vendor. Their collection methods for intelligence vary wildly. So which vendor do I select, right? Today, we're forensically investigating incidents. And what that means is after the bad guy has already done what they wanted to do, that's when we go in and we say, okay, how did they do it? And that's when we're investing in cybersecurity. After a security incident has occurred, that's when suddenly there's budget to hire expensive incident response teams and expensive tools and hire more people and things like that. And we have IT sprawl. We know we need security cameras, so we buy these IP cameras. We know we need DVRs for those, so we buy these DVRs. This is prominent more in government and healthcare and actually higher education as well than in other businesses. But oftentimes the adoption of what used to be standard tools is contributing to IT sprawl. And it's really challenging for IT teams to have good asset management as a result, right? What we want to do today is we don't want to alert on the final steps of a threat actor detonating their payload. We want to stop and disrupt that kill chain at all steps, starting at reconnaissance, right? And we can do that by applying some traditional intelligence fundamentals, like from before the internet was even born, where we can multi-source our intelligence from observations from many different sources. We can corroborate those reports across vendors, and we can multi-source our protection as a result, right? And I think the security community is working in this direction, but it's still an emerging technology. It's an emerging process, and it has flaws, right? Because when I buy an antivirus, the vendor has their own intelligence, but to me, that's just data. So some organization on the other side of the world clicked a phishing link, and that phishing link did a few things. How do I know that's relevant to my enterprise? How do I know that that's an attack vector that I'm going to suffer? The fact of the matter is, it's just data. There's several steps for my enterprise that need to be undertaken to turn that data into information, and then into knowledge, and then into intelligence. And actually, on the next screen, I have a little graphic that demonstrates that. As an enterprise IT guy or gal, anybody who's tried to build an IT system and then recover from a ransomware attack probably knows that systems need to be architected with security in mind from the ground up. What this requires is a bridge between the technical personnel and the leadership, so that all aspects of the architecting of this system, along with security, are understood. It needs to be holistic and continuous, with the technical side of the house and the business side of the house constantly talking and managing that project together. So if I'm standing up a VPN, the leadership knows, hey, we need this. And the technical folks know, okay, well, we want a VPN that these are the requirements and this is how we're going to secure it. And that should be a continuous cycle throughout the project management life cycle for any IT project, right? Whether it's installing IP cameras and deciding which ones to buy and which DVRs to buy and how we're going to secure those, how we're going to segment those in our network, who's going to have access to them. If we're going to have a third party, how are they going to manage it? Things like that. So establishing those processes to empower the leadership to make decisions and understand the project timeline as a result will make a strong defense. Investing in cyber security strategically, right? So there's a plethora of tools and technologies and vendors out there. And what we're seeing is that as an enterprise, I can throw money at tools all day long and still not be able to buy all the tools. I can throw money at human resources all day long and still not have the right human resources or enough of them. So having a plan for investment in cybersecurity strategically is going to be important. Knowing which layers of the stack that I'm investing in is important, and that should directly reflect on what services I need to run the business, and rather than rely on security tools as they're configured, I want to understand the technology improvements that are coming down the pipe. Sometimes this is available in release notes, sometimes it's in forums, sometimes it's in the community. But understanding what those vulnerabilities and weaknesses are, as well as improvements, will help that strategic investment in cybersecurity, because if a new feature comes down the pipe or is being worked on at my email security layer, maybe I don't need sandboxing for that, or whatever the case might be, or deception technology, right? Maybe I can look forward to that new feature to perform a security operation that I'm looking forward to. And then maintaining the perimeter. This is going to be a huge challenge and a huge reward for security operators, right? Because one of the biggest concerns from folks that I talk to is the lack of visibility into their remote assets, which are greatly increased in their number since, COVID changed the world. So even if I have a decentralized perimeter where my perimeter is the endpoint, understanding that will allow me to architect a cybersecurity solution for that topology. Right. Then, to me, this is what the modern approach looks like. What I have to work with in my legacy tools or even in the emerging technologies is a lot of data, and having processes and partnerships to turn that data into intelligence is going to be important. This is not just from the cybersecurity side as far as, hey, is this a phishing link and is one that I need to worry about? It's also from the IT architecture side. And this is something that CCSI and Centripetal understand very well together across all those bullet points we just covered in mitigation, from implementation to securing, right? And then I want to take a minute. I can't see my clock, so I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, but this is how Centripetal does it. So what I learned, I've been fighting ransomware for, since it started really hitting us in 2015. And it was a game of whack-a-mole for me. When I came to Centripetal, I saw how we were fighting ransomware as well as other cyber threats. And I decided that this was the best bang for my buck and how I wanted to defend against ransomware. And what we do is we're a fully managed, intelligence-driven cybersecurity service focused on protection, where we partner with about 80 different providers of threat data, some really well-known names across the spectrum of government resources, private industry relationships that we've established, as well as the open source community. And we spent the last 10 or 12 years developing the technology that we can deploy all that threat data to, the enforcement point that you see on the screen. It's called a threat intelligence gateway. It's uniquely built to handle not only the volume with which threat data is available, but the cadence with which it changes. And we pair that with data analytics at the reporting tool to make sure that as we operationalize the threat data and curate it and deploy the highest confidence, highest fidelity threat data, that we can use it to go through a continuous workflow of analyzing the output and coming up with good recommendations to shield on. And through that methodology, we can shield about 90 to 99% of all traffic before it either hits the perimeter or flies free to the internet from the inside. And in this way, we've actually stopped ransomware from detonating by blocking the command and control that would create the encryption keys. We've alerted clients to which asset was infected and which ones needed response to. But really, we took a lot of the heat off the fire by shielding that activity, preventing the encryption. But really, this is how we stop and disrupt that kill chain from step one. We provide that cover and concealment from the reconnaissance phase on through. And as holistically as we can, we stop the bad guys from even knowing our clients are there. And, essentially we pair the client with their own cybersecurity analyst, somebody they know on a first name basis, such as Colin Little. And that person, that analyst, is well-versed in cybersecurity. They'll pair their institutional knowledge of the threat landscape as it changes with working knowledge of the client's business, what services they need to make the lights run and make the business run. They'll also bring an intimate familiarity of all that threat data, which providers are best to protect, the use cases for our clients, depending on what services and operations they undertake in their business. And they also bring to the table, the context behind why a piece of threat data is in a provider's feeds, so that we can marry those reports with what we're seeing in the client environment and make a real effort to boil all those millions of machine-generated events down into what they a couple that they really need to be aware of, and also bring all the evidence and resources that our clients need to understand the traffic, understand the risks, and make that technical and business decision about it, regardless of their level of technical inclination. If they're a manager, they're not going to understand a lot of the technical behind it, and it's our job to make sure that they understand what's happening and what the risks are. And that's what we do in a nutshell here at Centripetal. And that's really what I had today. I feel like I zoomed right through that, but I'd like to invite our attendees to ask some questions. If you do have questions that come up after the webinar, please don't hesitate to reach out to me at my email address. As I said, I'm an evangelist against ransomware, and I know that speaking for myself and speaking for CCSI, we would invite any questions and any engagement after the fact.
Thanks, Colin. We got a few questions in. Hold on. So the first question we got was, looking to the future, where would you say the trends are leading us in terms of ransomware evolution?
Wow, that's a good question. So to answer that question, I want to parallel a lot of the current events that are being documented in physical conflicts, such as the war in Ukraine, with the current state of ransomware. I just read an article the other day that due to physical attacks on critical infrastructure in Ukraine, a lot of the hospitals are transferring patients because they don't have power and things like that, or running water. We see that in today's threat landscape against ransomware, where I also read several articles the other day that a lot of hospitals are having to transfer patients and postpone operations for their clients because of ransomware infections. And actually, just this week, there were 3 or 4 different hospitals around the world that were experiencing a ransomware event. Given the state that we're in today, I would say, looking forward to the next 5 years, that we will see a continuation in the escalation of the size and impact of ransomware events, such as the Colonial Pipeline attack that occurred last year, that had a huge impact on, I would say at least a regional, if not a countrywide scale, where folks needed fuel, but the pipeline had to suspend operations. I foresee that escalation continuing until there's an event so large that it will probably change civilization as we know it. It's kind of scary to think about, but as I look to the future, that's why I continue the fight against ransomware today. Thanks for asking.
Thanks, Colin. Another question we got in was, when you were in the trenches, how did you stop ransomware?
Wow, that's a good question, and a story that the time to take to tell would probably fill another webinar. But I was with the state of Maine running a data loss prevention program, and then I supplemented the security team whenever they needed for incident response capabilities. So we went from about 3 ransomware infections a week to about 26. The situation became untenable very quickly. We were just getting eaten alive. So what I did, and this is looking back, one of the reasons why I'm very thankful to be able to be a part of this solution that Centripetal deploys today, because it was really manual and arduous. But I was forensically investigating the assets to determine how the bad guys got in and where I could disrupt it. So oftentimes I was creating manually programmed rules in like my antivirus or my firewall to stop part of that kill chain. For example, that PowerShell executable writing screensaver files to temporary directories, and probably 6 other rules like that. was how I was stopping ransomware at an enterprise level. I was also ingesting intelligence from, some good government resources like the MSISAC to try to proactively protect against ransomware. But using that manual process, that started in 2016, and in 2017, we stopped about 800 ransomware infections without preventing any business operations, which is really what we do here at Centripetal now. But that was a really frustrating game of whack-a-mole, and there were some variants that were fileless that I couldn't prevent, which was also frustrating. And it was actually that time where I transitioned to Centripetal to use a more effective tool set and capability to prevent ransomware. But yeah, that's when I was in the trenches on the enterprise side. Thanks for asking.
Great, thanks. And the last question, how do we maintain the perimeter in the remote workforce age?
So there are a few methodologies that I have come across in my dealing with different enterprises. Some of them seem draconian, and some of them are evolving. One way is with, cloud-based service, where I have an agent on all my remote endpoints, and that leads them not just directly to the internet, but through some sort of security, right? There are very few holistic solutions for that. The other methodology that I would offer is, and I've come across this more in highly secure environments, but having that remote asset have a full-time, full-tunnel VPN connection back to the mothership, so to speak, so that all that traffic goes through my existing security stack. Not an ideal solution for most people that I've talked to, but I would actually probably engage CCSI for a lot of those answers, as it seems like that's what what y'all specialize in as well. So there's probably more solutions that they can apprise you to.
Thanks, Colin. That's it for all the questions. I'll pass the ball to Kathleen now.
Oh, great. Thanks, Kat. Colin, that was wonderful information. Thank you so much. It was very informative, and I am sure the attendees have a lot to take away with. I want to remind everyone to fill out the survey that you will be receiving. I know the webinar went a little bit long, but it is recorded, so we will also forward you the recorded link to the session, so you'll have the answers and the questions that we covered today. Our account managers will be following up with all of you as well. We can certainly help you strengthen your security posturing together. So again, thank you for your time today, and we look forward to working with you in the future to strengthen your defenses against ransomware. Thanks, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. Stay safe. Thank you, Vince.
That was great, Colin. Thank you. No.